Before the break, we looked into the region of Israel or Palestine and looked at the history of the name and the meaning behind it. We see various empires coming and trying to conquer the area, but allowing self-governance to some degree and the name Judah or Yehud to stay, to represent the original inhabitants. That is until the Romans come to town and the Jews revolt against them, and as an act of defiance against the Jews, they rename their capital city of Jerusalem, or their country itself, to Syria Palestina as an insult, along with replacing their temple with a temple to Jupiter, the god of Rome. If we look into the idea of colonization, as many people use it today, we could see very clearly the attempt to colonize the land of Judea by various empires, especially the Romans, who decided to rename and reestablish their own dominance in the area. We can see the Roman Caesars installing their own puppet governors and puppet kings in order to enforce Roman rule and religion and put down any possible revolts against the Roman Empire. The colonization, of course, continued as we see further empires coming in and installing their own beliefs and their own rules over the Jewish people. We see the Ottoman Empire rise and treat Jews in different ways, including inviting them back to their original homeland in the land of Israel, still a province under the Ottoman Empire. We see flourishing of the Kabbalistic thinking in Tzfat, and we see the reestablishment of Jewish lands within the region. It wasn't until the British came where the land of Palestine became an official mandate or colony of the British Empire, where rules were imposed and laws were put in place to restrict Jewish people from returning to their homeland, essentially forbidding or minimizing the return by the indigenous peoples to their land. Of course, at the same time, we do see an influx of Muslims and Arabs coming into the land from the Ottoman Empire, which then causes the conflict that arises under the British. Today, there's a very big push on indigenous rights, whether it is in North America or Australia or other places in the world. The UN has really put a big effort on trying to return indigenous rights. So in the history of the Palestinian area or the state of Israel today, we wonder who is really the indigenous people to the land. Why is it for some reason that the UN and the left and many other people don't feel that the Israelites have a claim or the Jewish people have a claim to the land of Israel, and that, in fact, the Palestinians belong to the land? And there's an interesting reason behind that. We've already seen that the Israelites predate those of the Palestinians of today, the people who believe themselves to be Palestinians according to the 1950s PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization. Some people, of course, may suggest that, yeah, the Israelites were originally people from this area, but they left. They were gone. They went to Europe. They went to North Africa. So the land is no longer theirs. However, that is ignoring the fact that Jews have always had a presence within the land. And whenever they left, it was due to expulsion or exile by a colonial power. So how has history somehow been rewritten to suggest that the Israelites are not an indigenous people and that in reality, somehow the Palestinians were there first? And the answer to that is right in the question itself, the name Palestine. The fact that the Palestinian people have now taken on the name Palestinians suggests that they were the original people from the land of Palestine. However, this is rewriting history. The land of Palestine was a Jewish region, and only until the Crusades and the Ottoman Empire did we see an influx of non-Jewish residents, in addition to the Jewish residents who always remained. If you look at photos or records from Palestine during the British Mandate, you'll see for the most part it's Jewish people and Israeli flags with a Star of David representing the Eretz Israel. Of course, this is not to suggest that the Palestinians of today don't have some claim to the land. However, this claim comes far after the Israelites and the Judeans lived in the land for many years. Personally, I don't mind the idea to suggest that Palestinians do have some claim to the land based on the history that they have there. However, I'm really frustrated hearing the left and the UN and people who are all about indigenous rights trying to rewrite history and remove the indigenous nature of the Israelites to their land. Or worse, somehow suggesting that the clock only starts on indigenous rights at a certain point that they choose. How do we pick an arbitrary day to start the clock? Imagine if indigenous rights people decided that the First Nations of North America are not indigenous to the land because actually the clock begins when the colonial power showed up. That's who owns the land from now on. Those are the indigenous people. That really is essentially what's happening today in the land of Israel. Instead of calling it colonizing, like some people do, We Jews should be calling it decolonizing. We are trying to go back to Judea or Yehud, where we had control and self-governance over our own piece of land and no longer are subservient to foreign powers who try and control us. If we think about it, we went from the Israelite independent kingdom through province after province of colonizers until we reached the 1940s when the Israelite kingdom or Israelite state was reestablished. Essentially, what we're suggesting here is that the Israelite state finally removed the colonizers from their land to create their own land yet again. In the end, we have to think about the fact that the Israelites do have the claim to the land, but so do the Palestinians from very different time frames. We also have to accept the fact that both people are not going to just disappear and that this is a long-term solution we need to find. So when we talk about freeing Palestine, you have to think to yourself that freeing Palestine really does mean a free state for the Jews that was once called Syria Palestina, free from the superpowers that were colonizing the land. And when we talk about Palestinians from a historical sense, up until the 1950s, this would have been the Jewish people of the land of Israel. And only after the 1950s did the Palestinian people that we know them today claim the name Palestinians and try and hijack the cause of freeing Palestine for themselves. However, unlike the Israelite people who are trying to free themselves from the colonial powers, the Palestinian people of today who happily lived under Arab rules for generations are looking to free themselves from the people who rightfully belong in the land of Israel. One activist that I've been looking into recently is Rudy Rockman. He's a gentleman that is trying to create this peace between the two peoples using conversation to find common ground and realizing that these two peoples can live together in peace. But he points out the fact that this polarization between the two peoples claiming that the land belongs to them and nobody else is what's fueling the conflict. If you haven't checked out some of his work, I highly suggest checking him out on social media or on YouTube. Hopefully this episode has helped you better understand the history behind the region of Israel or Palestine and the history of colonialism in the area and who really is the colonizer in this story. As always, thank you for listening and check us out on social media at jdr.podcast. Check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.